rope cut into Alira's wrists, as 4 members of her own pack dragged her across the wet rocks toward the edge of the cliff. Below her, the ocean roared like something alive, black waves crashing against jagged stone with a hunger that made her stomach turn. She did not scream. She had learned years ago that screaming changed nothing in the Moonfall pack. Marla stood at the front of the crowd, her arms crossed, her face lit by torchlight and satisfaction. She was not Alira's real mother, only the woman who had raised her after her mother vanished when Alira was 3 years old. For 18 years, Marla had called her useless. Tonight, she called her necessary. "The sea spirits have taken 6 hunters this season," Marla said, her voice carrying over the wind. "The elders say an offering must be given during the blood tide, or the whole pack will starve through winter. Alira has no mate, no pups, no true place among us. She is the one we can spare." A murmur rose from the gathered wolves. Some looked uneasy. Most looked away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Alira searched the crowd for anyone who might object, anyone who remembered that she had spent years tending the sick, teaching the pups their letters, mending nets before dawn so the hunters could eat. No one moved. Garrick, the pack alpha, raised his hand, and the 2 wolves holding her ropes pulled tighter. He was a broad man with a scar across his jaw, and he had never once looked at Alira as anything more than an obligation left behind by a woman who had abandoned them both. "It is decided," he said. "The offering will be made before the moon reaches its peak." Alira's heart pounded as they forced her closer to the edge. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face, salt spray stinging her eyes. She thought of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, a face she had to imagine more than recall. She thought of the years she had spent trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided she did not belong, and she thought, with a strange and sudden clarity, that she was not afraid to die. She was only afraid that no one would remember she had lived. "Please," she said quietly, not to the crowd, but to herself. "Someone, anyone." No one answered. Garrick nodded once, and the 2 wolves released the ropes binding her wrists, but kept their grip on her arms. They walked her to the very edge of the cliff, where the rock dropped away into churning darkness. The waves below seemed to reach upward, as if they had been waiting for her arrival for a very long time. "The sea takes what it is given," Marla said, stepping forward one last time. There was no sorrow in her voice, no hesitation, only relief, as though a burden she had carried for 18 years was finally being set down. "Forgive us, Alira. This is for the good of the pack." Alira looked at the woman who had raised her, and found, for the first time in her life, that she felt nothing at all. No anger, no grief, only a strange, hollow calm, as if her body already understood what her mind refused to accept. Then the hands released her, and the world tilted, and she was falling. The fall lasted only seconds, but it felt endless. The wind screamed past her ears, the cliff face blurred into a streak of gray stone, and the ocean rushed up to meet her with a violence that stole the breath from her lungs before she even struck the water. The impact was like being struck by stone. Cold seized every part of her body at once, an icy grip that drove the air from her chest and sent her spiraling down into darkness. Salt water filled her mouth, her nose, her throat. She thrashed instinctively, though some distant part of her mind understood there was nowhere to swim, no surface close enough to reach before her strength gave out. Down she sank, past the churn of the waves, into a deeper stillness, where the water grew darker and colder still. Her limbs slowed. Her chest burned with the need for air she could not take. She thought, absurdly, of the pups she had taught to swim in the shallow tide pools near the shore, how she had held their small paws and told them not to be afraid of the water. She had never imagined the water would be the thing to take her. Just as her vision began to fracture into shards of black and silver light, something changed. A warmth spread through her veins, faint at first, like the first light of dawn touching a dark room. It began in her chest and radiated outward, down her arms, through her fingertips, into her legs. The cold that had gripped her began to recede, pushed back by something ancient and unfamiliar stirring beneath her skin. The water around her seemed to shift, to gather, to respond to her presence the way iron responds to a magnet. Alira's eyes, which had begun to close, opened wide in the darkness. She could see. Not clearly, not the way she saw on land, but enough to make out shapes moving in the deep water around her. shapes that had not been there a moment before. The pain in her chest eased. The desperate need to breathe faded into something softer, something that felt almost like breathing itself, though she knew that was impossible. She was still sinking, but the sinking no longer felt like drowning. It felt like being carried. Above her, far above, she could see the faint shimmer of moonlight breaking through the surface of the water, and for a moment, she wondered if she was already dead, if this strange peace was simply what death felt like for a wolf who had been thrown away by her own family. Then a shadow moved through the water toward her, vast and swift, cutting through the current with a power that sent ripples of pressure against her skin even at this depth. Elira's instincts screamed at her to be afraid, but the strange warmth in her chest did not recognize the shadow as a threat. If anything, it seemed to recognize the shadow as something else entirely, something like an answer to a question she had never known to ask. The shape drew closer, and Elira realized it was not a fish, not a whale, not any creature of the deep she had ever heard described in the pack's old stories. It moved like a man might move if a man could swim as fast and as silently as the current itself, arms cutting through the water with purpose, eyes fixed directly on her. Her mind, foggy from cold and lack of air, could not make sense of what she was seeing. A person, here, in the deep water where no ordinary person could survive without drowning. And yet he moved as though the ocean were simply another kind of ground beneath his feet, as natural to him as the forest floor was to a wolf on land. He reached her in seconds, and up close, she could see him more clearly, even in the dim light filtering down from the surface. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that moved around his face in the current. His eyes, when they met hers, held an intensity that cut through her fading consciousness like a blade through fog. There was something commanding in his gaze, something that made her feel, even as she was dying, as though she had just been noticed by someone who had been searching for her for a very long time. He did not hesitate. His arms closed around her, pulling her against him with a strength that felt impossible, and then they were moving, rising through the water at a speed that should have been unbearable for a body already starved of air. The pressure of the ascent pressed against her skull, and she felt herself losing what little consciousness she had left, the strange warmth in her chest flickering like a candle in a strong wind. The last thing she saw before darkness took her completely was the surface of the water rushing closer, closer, a silver ceiling breaking apart as they burst through it into the open night air. Cold wind struck her face. She gasped, though she was not entirely sure her body understood what breathing meant anymore, and salt water and air rushed into her lungs in a violent, painful mixture that made her cough and choke against the chest of the man holding her. He said nothing at first. He simply held her above the waterline, treading with an ease that defied the churning waves around them, watching her with those same intense eyes as she fought her way back to consciousness. When her coughing subsided and her breathing steadied into something almost normal, he spoke, and his voice was low, deep, carrying an authority that seemed to still the very water around them. "You are safe now," he said. "No one will hurt you again." Elira stared at him, too exhausted and too disoriented to form words. She did not know this man. She did not know how he had found her in the darkness of the open ocean, or how he had reached her so quickly, or why the water itself seemed to bend and curve around him, as though it recognized him as something more than a stranger passing through its depths. She only knew that for the first time in 18 years, someone had come for her. Someone had looked at her and decided she was worth saving. He began to swim toward the shore, cutting through the waves with the same effortless power he had shown when he first appeared, carrying her against his chest, as though she weighed nothing at all. Elira drifted in and out of awareness during the swim, catching fragments of moonlight on the water, the distant outline of the cliffs where her pack had thrown her only minutes before, the steady rhythm of the stranger's heartbeat beneath her ear. When they finally reached the shallows near the base of the cliffs, he did not set her down immediately. He carried her onto the wet sand, above the reach of the tide, and knelt to lay her gently on the ground. Elira's body trembled with cold and shock, her lungs still aching from the water she had swallowed, but she was alive. Impossibly, undeniably alive. Above them, on the cliff, torches still burned. The Moonfall pack had not yet dispersed, and as shouts began to rise from the gathered wolves, Elira understood that they had seen. They had watched a stranger emerge from the ocean and pull her from the water they had thrown her into. The man beside her rose to his feet, water streaming from his dark hair and clothing, and looked up at the cliff with an expression that had shifted from gentle concern to something colder, harder, something that made the wolves at the top of the cliff go silent. "Who are you?" Elira managed to whisper, her voice raw from salt and cold. He looked down at her, and for a brief moment, the hardness in his face softened again. "My name is Kale," he said. "And you, I think, are someone your pack should never have thrown away." Before she could ask what he meant, shouts erupted from above as more wolves gathered at the cliff's edge, staring down in disbelief at the impossible sight of a stranger standing on the shore with the girl they had sacrificed only minutes before. Garrick's voice rose above the others, sharp with confusion and something that sounded almost like fear. "That is not possible," Garrick shouted down. "No one survives the blood tide offering. No one has ever survived it." Kale did not answer him. Instead, he knelt beside Elira once more, gently helping her sit up, his movements careful despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. "Can you stand?" he asked her quietly, his voice completely different from the commanding tone he had used moments before, softer now, meant only for her. Elira nodded, though her legs felt weak and her whole body still trembled from the cold. With his help, she rose unsteadily to her feet, leaning against him for support as she stared up at the cliff where her pack watched in stunned silence. "They tried to kill you," Kale said, and it was not a question. His jaw tightened as he studied the faces peering down from above. "They bound your hands and threw you into the sea as though you were nothing." "I am nothing," Elira said quietly, the words coming out before she could stop them, a lifetime of being told exactly that, finally surfacing in a moment of complete exhaustion. "I have always been nothing to them." Kale turned to look at her fully then, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "You are wrong," he said. "And before this night is over, everyone standing on that cliff is going to understand exactly how wrong they were to treat you this way." He turned back toward the cliff and called up to the wolves gathered there, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the waves, resonant with an authority that made even Garrick take an involuntary step back. "I am Kale Draven," he announced, "Alpha King of the Tideborn. And the woman you threw into the ocean tonight is not an offering. She belongs to a bloodline your pack destroyed and buried 18 years ago, and I intend to find out exactly how much you all knew about it." Silence fell over the cliff. Even the wind seemed to still. Elira, standing on trembling legs beside a man she had known for less than an hour, felt something shift inside her chest. A question she had carried her entire life, finally beginning to find an answer. Who was she, really? And why had the ocean, of all things, chosen to save her rather than take her? Kale turned back to her, his eyes searching her face, as though looking for something he already expected to find. "Your mother," he said quietly. "Did she ever tell you where she came from before she arrived at this pack?" Elira shook her head slowly. "She disappeared when I was 3. I barely remember her at all." Something flickered across Kale's face, a mixture of sorrow and recognition that Elira could not fully interpret. "Then there is a great deal you do not know about yourself," he said. "And I think it is time someone finally told you the truth." Above them, the wolves of the Moonfall pack began to descend the narrow path toward the shore, torches flickering in the wind, faces caught between fear and disbelief. Garrick led them, his expression hard, though something uncertain flickered behind his eyes as he took in the sight of the Alpha King standing protectively beside the girl his pack had sacrificed. "This is Moonfall territory," Garrick said as he reached the bottom of the path, his voice carrying an edge of forced authority. "You have no right to interfere with our rituals." Kale's gaze swept over him with something close to contempt. "Your ritual," he said, "was murder. And the girl you tried to murder is the last surviving heir of a royal bloodline that your pack has kept hidden, whether through ignorance or deliberate cruelty, for 18 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd of wolves gathering on the shore. Elira felt every eye turn toward her, the same eyes that had watched her be bound and thrown from the cliff, now staring at her with something entirely different. Shock, disbelief. In some faces, the first stirrings of fear. Marla pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face pale in the torchlight. "That cannot be true," she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Her mother was nothing but a wanderer who asked our pack for shelter. She had no title, no crown, Nothing. Her mother, Cale said, his voice dropping into something dangerous and quiet, was Ilyana, of House Draven, sister to the previous Tideborn king, and mother to the heir that enemies of our throne have been hunting for 18 years. She did not come to your pack as a wanderer. She came here to hide, because she believed this was the one place her daughter would never be found. He looked down at Alira, and something in his expression softened again, though the anger beneath it remained clear. She was wrong to trust you, he said, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. But she was not wrong about one thing. No one thought to look for a princess among wolves who treated her like a servant. Alira's mind reeled. A princess, an heir, words that belonged in the stories her mother used to tell her, faint memories she had assumed were nothing more than a young child's imagination. She looked down at her own trembling hands, hands that had scrubbed floors and mended nets for 18 years, and tried to reconcile them with the word Cale had just spoken. I don't understand, she said quietly. If this is true, why would my mother hide me here? Why would she leave me with people who treated me like this? Cale's expression grew grave. Because the alternative was worse, he said. The enemies who destroyed our royal line would have killed you the moment they found you. Your mother chose the lesser danger. She could not have known how cruelly this pack would treat a child they believed had no value. Garrick stepped forward again, though his earlier bravado had faded into something more cautious. Even if this is true, he said, she is grown now. She has no claim on our pack. Take her, if you believe what you say. We want nothing more to do with this matter. Cale's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Alira thought he might do something far more severe than simply take her away. But instead, he turned back to her, offering his hand. Come, he said gently. You do not belong here. You never did. It is time you learned who you really are, and what you were always meant to become. Alira looked once more at the faces of the only family she had ever known, faces that had shown her nothing but coldness and cruelty for 18 years, and found that she felt no desire to stay, no need for their approval or their apology. She took Cale's hand. Behind them, the ocean continued to crash against the shore, indifferent to everything that had just been revealed, though Alira could have sworn, as she turned to walk away from the cliffs that had nearly claimed her life, that the water seemed calmer than it had been in weeks. She did not look back again. Cale led Alira along the shoreline, away from the cliffs and the pack that had thrown her away, until the sound of the waves softened behind them, and the outline of the Moonfall territory disappeared into darkness. She walked in silence, her mind too crowded with everything she had just learned to form any coherent thought. A princess, a bloodline, enemies who had hunted her since before she could remember. None of it felt real, and yet her body, still trembling from the cold water, told her plainly that everything that had happened tonight was real indeed. Where are we going? She finally asked, her voice hoarse. To my kingdom, Cale said. It lies beneath the water, hidden from those who do not know how to find it. You will be safe there, safer than you have ever been. Alira glanced toward the dark ocean, stretching endlessly beside them. Beneath the water, she repeated. I nearly drowned an hour ago. Now you expect me to walk willingly back into the sea? For the first time, something like amusement flickered across Cale's face, softening the hard lines that had dominated his expression since he pulled her from the depths. You will not drown, he said. Not anymore. The power that saved you tonight is part of who you are. It always has been. You simply never had reason to discover it before now. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm her, the adrenaline that had kept her upright finally draining away, and leaving her limbs heavy and unsteady. Cale noticed before she had to say anything. Without asking, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her the way he had carried her from the ocean, and this time, she was too tired to protest. Sleep, he said quietly. You are safe. I will not let anything happen to you. Despite everything, despite not knowing this man at all beyond the fact that he had saved her life and upended everything she thought she knew about herself, Alira found that she believed him. Her eyes grew heavy, and within minutes, the rhythm of his steady steps along the shore lulled her into a deep and dreamless sleep. When she woke, she was lying in a bed unlike anything she had ever seen. The sheets were soft as clouds, woven from some material she could not name, and the room around her glowed with a soft blue light, that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though sunlight were filtering down through deep water. She sat up slowly, her body aching but no longer trembling with cold, and looked around in wonder. The walls of the room curved gently, made from something that resembled coral, but felt smooth and warm to the touch. Windows, if they could be called that, revealed swaying underwater gardens outside, schools of luminous fish drifting past in lazy patterns. She realized with a jolt, actually beneath the ocean, in a kingdom that should not have been possible. A soft knock came at the door, and before Alira could respond, a young woman entered carrying a tray of food. She had warm brown skin, dark curls pulled back from her face, and a friendly smile that put Alira slightly at ease, despite the strangeness of everything around her.
"You're awake," the woman said cheerfully. "I'm Nadia. King Kale asked me to look after you while you recover. How are you feeling?"
Confused, Alira admitted. "Where exactly am I?" Nadia set the tray down on a small table beside the bed and gestured toward the window. "This is the sunken court, the heart of the Tideborn kingdom. It's been hidden beneath these waters for generations, protected by old magic that keeps it safe from outsiders." She paused, studying Alira with open curiosity. "Everyone is talking about you, you know. The lost princess, returned after all these years." Alira felt a flush of discomfort at the title. "I'm not sure I believe any of this is real," she admitted. "Yesterday, I was nothing but an unwanted burden in my pack. Now people are calling me a princess." Nadia's expression softened with unexpected sympathy. "I heard what happened to you," she said quietly. "What your pack did. I am sorry you had to endure that. But I promise you, here, things are different. King Kale does not tolerate cruelty, especially not toward someone of his own bloodline's allies." "His own bloodline's allies?" Alira repeated. "What does that mean?" Nadia hesitated, as though she had said more than she meant to, then offered a small, apologetic smile. "That is something the king should explain himself. Eat something first. You've been through a great deal, and you'll need your strength for what comes next." Alira ate slowly, her mind turning over everything Nadia had said, questions multiplying faster than she could organize them. When she finished, Nadia helped her dress in unfamiliar but beautiful clothing, soft fabric that seemed to shimmer faintly like moonlight on water, and led her through winding coral corridors toward what she called the throne room. The sunken court was even more breathtaking than Alira's chamber had suggested. Great archways of coral and stone rose overhead, threaded with veins of glowing blue light. Gardens of swaying sea plants lined the corridors, and everywhere she looked, Tideborn citizens went about their lives with an ease and grace that spoke of generations spent living beneath the waves. Some glanced at her with curiosity as she passed, whispering to one another, though none approached directly. When they reached the throne room, Kale was already there, seated upon a throne carved from pale stone that seemed to catch and hold the ambient light of the chamber. He rose the moment he saw her, his expression shifting from something distant and formal to genuine relief. "You look well," he said, descending the steps to meet her. "Better than you did last night, certainly." "I still don't understand what happened last night," Alira said honestly. "Or what's happening now. Nadia mentioned something about your bloodline's allies. What did she mean?" Kale's expression grew serious, and he gestured for her to sit with him on a nearby bench, overlooking one of the gardens, away from the ears of the small crowd still lingering near the throne. Once they were seated, he took a slow breath, as though preparing to share something heavy. "Your mother, Ilyana, was not merely a member of the Tideborn royal family," he said. "She was betrothed, long ago, to my father, before either of us was born. An alliance meant to unite two branches of our people. When the enemies of our throne rose against us, they targeted her specifically, believing that eliminating her would weaken our claim to power. She fled before they could reach her, carrying you, already the last hope of restoring our bloodline's strength." Alira absorbed this slowly. "So my mother was meant to be your father's wife," she said. "And I was meant to be born into a position of great importance to our kingdom," Kale finished for her. "Yes, when word reached us, years later, that Ilyana had died in hiding and her daughter's fate was unknown, many believed our hope of reuniting the bloodlines had died with her. I confess, even I had begun to accept that possibility, until last night, when I felt something in the water that I have not felt since I was a child, standing beside my father, learning to sense the presence of tide-born blood in the tide. You felt me, Elira said slowly, remembering the strange warmth that had spread through her chest as she sank into the darkness. That's how you found me so quickly. Kale nodded. The moment you touched deep water, your blood called out, the way our ancestors' blood always has. I was patrolling nearby, and I felt it as clearly as I would feel a hand grasping my own in the dark. I did not know, at first, that it was you. I only knew that a member of tide-born blood was drowning, and I could not simply let that happen. Elira sat with this for a long moment, watching the gentle sway of the underwater garden beyond the window, trying to reconcile the girl who had spent 18 years believing she was worthless, with the possibility that she had, all along, been part of something ancient and important. It felt too large to hold, too strange to fully accept. Why didn't my mother ever tell me any of this? She finally asked. Why let me grow up thinking I was nobody? Kale's expression grew gentle, almost pained. I imagined she believed that ignorance would protect you, he said. If you did not know what you were, you could not accidentally reveal it to those who might have been searching for you. It was not cruelty on her part, Elira. It was the only kind of protection she had left to give. The use of her name, spoken so gently after a night of chaos and revelation, struck something deep within her chest. For the first time since she had been thrown from the cliff, Elira felt tears rising, not from grief or fear, but from something closer to relief. Someone had finally explained the empty space at the center of her life, the question of why she had never quite belonged anywhere. She had not been unwanted. She had been hidden. What happens now? She asked quietly, wiping at her eyes. Kale studied her for a long moment before answering. Now, he said, you begin to learn who you truly are, your abilities, your history, your place among our people. It will not be simple, and there are those who will not welcome your return easily. But you will not face any of it alone. I intend to make certain of that. Something in the way he said it, steady and resolute, made Elira believe him completely. For the first time and longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. Nadia found her later that evening, sitting alone beside one of the garden windows, watching the slow drift of glowing fish through the dark water outside. She settled beside Elira without invitation, the easy familiarity of someone who had already decided they would be friends. The whole court is buzzing about you, Nadia said. Some are thrilled. A few are worried about what your return means for the balance of power here, and at least one or two are convinced you're some kind of trick sent by our enemies. Elira let out a tired laugh, the first genuine laugh she had managed since the previous night. That seems fair, actually. I'm not entirely convinced I'm not dreaming this whole thing myself. For what it's worth, Nadia said, more seriously now, I believe the king made the right choice bringing you here. And I don't think he's ever knelt before anyone in the years I've served this court. Not once. Whatever you are to him, to this kingdom, it matters. You should trust that, even if you don't trust much else right now. Elira turned the words over in her mind, long after Nadia left her alone again. Trust did not come easily to her, not after a lifetime of being told she was unwanted. But something about the quiet certainty in Kale's voice, the way the ocean itself seemed to answer to her blood, made her wonder, for the first time, if trust might be worth the risk. The council chamber fell silent the moment Kale entered, Elira walking beside him, with her chin held high, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. 7 advisors sat around a curved stone table, each of them turning to study her, with expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open suspicion. This was not the warm welcome Nadia had described from the common folk of the court. This was something colder, sharper, the kind of scrutiny reserved for a stranger claiming a place among people who had spent their lives protecting something precious. My king, said an older woman seated at the head of the table, her silver hair braided with small shells. You say this girl is Ileana's daughter. Forgive me, but we have heard such claims before. 3 times in the last decade. In fact, each one a lie, meant to gain favor or access to our throne. I do not simply say it, Priya, Kale replied evenly. I felt her blood call to mine the moment she touched deep water. You know as well as I do that such a thing cannot be faked. No imposter could summon that response. Priya's sharp eyes turned to Elira, studying her with the intensity of someone searching for cracks in a story. Even if that is true, she said, a bloodline alone does not make a queen. She was raised on land, among wolves, with no knowledge of our customs, our laws, our history. What use is royal blood in a body that has never learned to carry a crown? The words stung more than Alira expected, striking at the same insecurities that had plagued her entire life among the Moonfall pack. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, the old familiar shame of being told she was not enough threatening to swallow her whole. But this time, something else rose, alongside the shame. A flicker of defiance she had never quite allowed herself to feel before. I have spent 18 years learning how to survive people who decided I was worthless, before I ever had the chance to prove otherwise, Alira said, her voice steadier than she expected. I don't know your customs yet, I don't know your history, but I am willing to learn, if given the chance, rather than being dismissed before I've had one. Silence followed her words. Priya's expression shifted slightly, something like reluctant respect flickering behind her sharp gaze. A younger advisor near the end of the table, a man with warm eyes and a quiet demeanor, spoke up for the first time. She has her mother's spirit, at least, he said. I remember Ilyana speaking to this council in much the same way, the day she first arrived at this court, as a young woman betrothed to our former king. Perhaps that is worth something. Perhaps, Priya allowed, though her tone remained guarded. But spirit alone will not protect this kingdom from those who wish to see the Draven bloodline extinguished entirely. If word spreads that the lost heir has returned, our enemies will not wait long before acting. Kale's expression darkened. Then we prepare accordingly, he said. I did not bring Alira here to hide her away in shame, the way her mother was forced to hide her for 18 years. She deserves to know her own history, to claim her own place, and to decide for herself what role she wishes to play in this kingdom's future. The council debated late into the evening, voices rising and falling around questions of security, succession, and the delicate political balance that had held the Tideborn kingdom together since the near destruction of the royal line years before. Alira listened to most of it in silence, absorbing names and histories she had never heard before, feeling increasingly like a stranger sitting at the edge of a conversation about her own life. When the council finally adjourned, Kale walked with her back through the coral corridors, his expression thoughtful. I know that was not easy, he said. Priya can be harsh, but she has protected this kingdom loyally for decades. Her caution comes from experience, not cruelty. I understand, Alira said, and she meant it. After a lifetime among people whose cruelty came from indifference rather than genuine concern, Priya's sharp questions felt almost like a strange kind of respect, an acknowledgement that Alira's place here would need to be earned rather than simply granted. There is something I would like to show you, Kale said, changing the subject as they reached a set of doors carved with an intricate wave pattern. He pushed them open, revealing a room lined with shelves of ancient scrolls and portraits framed in coral and pearl. This is where our history is kept, including the history of your mother. Alira stepped inside slowly, drawn immediately to a large portrait hanging near the center of the room. A woman stood painted against a background of swirling blue water, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes the same shade of green as Alira's own. The resemblance was unmistakable, a mirror stretching backward through 18 years of separation. That's her, Alira whispered. That's my mother. Ilyana, of House Draven, Kale confirmed quietly, standing beside her. Painted the year before she disappeared. She was considered one of the most gifted water shapers our kingdom had produced in a generation. It said she could calm a violent storm with nothing more than a raised hand. Alira stared at the portrait, searching the painted face for some flicker of memory, some proof that the vague, half-formed images she carried of her mother were real, and not simply the invention of a lonely child's imagination. I don't remember much about her, she admitted. Just fragments. A voice singing something in a language I didn't understand, the smell of salt water on her clothes. She used to sing an old Tideborn lullaby, Kale said softly. My mother used to sing the same one to me, before she passed. It has been sung to Draven children for generations. Something in Alira's chest tightened at the thought that the fragments of memory she had carried her whole life, dismissed by her pack as childish nonsense, had been real pieces of a history far larger than she ever imagined. She reached out and touched the edge of the portrait's frame, feeling closer to her mother in this moment than she had felt in 18 years. Why didn't she come back? Alira asked quietly. If this kingdom was here, if you and your father might have protected her, why did she stay hidden among wolves who never valued her? Kale's expression grew somber. I do not know the full answer to that, he admitted. But I believe she feared that returning would draw the same enemies who had hunted her directly to our doorstep, endangering not just herself, but the entire kingdom she loved. She chose to sacrifice her own comfort, and yours, to protect something larger than either of you. Elira absorbed this in silence, grief and gratitude warring in her chest for a woman she barely remembered, but was beginning to understand more deeply with every passing hour. I wish I could have known her, she said finally. Really known her, not just fragments and portraits. Perhaps, Kale said gently, in learning about her, you will come to know yourself better as well. You carry more of her than you realize, Elira. I saw it tonight, in the council chamber, when you refused to let Priya's doubts silence you. They spent the rest of the evening in the archive room, Kale sharing stories of her mother's childhood at court, her friendships, her talents, the small details that painted a fuller picture of the woman Elira had lost so young. For the first time since her fall from the cliffs, Elira felt something other than confusion or fear settling into her chest. She felt the first threads of belonging, fragile but real, beginning to take root. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elira wandered the quiet corridors of the sunken court alone, drawn by some instinct she could not quite name, toward the edge of the palace, where the coral walls gave way to open water, visible through a great archway that seemed to serve as a boundary between the court and the sea beyond. She stood at the threshold, watching the dark water drift past, and found herself remembering the strange warmth that had spread through her chest as she sank beneath the waves. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached her hand out toward the water, wondering if what Kale had told her was true, if some ancient power truly lived within her blood. The water responded instantly, curling around her fingers like a living thing, gentle and curious, as though greeting an old friend. Elira gasped, pulling her hand back in surprise, and the water settled once more into its natural rhythm. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something closer to wonder. It recognizes you, a voice said from behind her, and she turned to find Kale standing a short distance away, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. The ocean has been waiting a long time for a Draven heir to return to these waters. I didn't mean to wake you, Elira said, slightly embarrassed at being caught in such a private moment. You didn't, Kale said, stepping closer. I often find myself drawn to this place at night as well. There is something calming about it, don't you think? The way the water simply exists, indifferent to all our struggles above and beneath its surface, and yet somehow still capable of carrying such power. Elira looked back out at the dark water, feeling, for the first time since the moment she had been thrown from the cliffs, something that resembled peace. I used to think the ocean was something to fear, she admitted, something that could take everything from you without warning. And now? Kale asked quietly. She considered the question carefully before answering. Now, I think perhaps it was never the ocean I needed to fear, she said. Perhaps I only needed to find where I truly belonged within it. Kale's gaze held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet darkness of the corridor. You belong here, Elira, he said finally, his voice low and certain. Whatever doubts Priya or anyone else on that council might raise, I have no doubt of that. Elira did not know how to respond to the certainty in his voice, the warmth that had settled into her chest at his words. She only knew that for the first time in 18 years, standing at the edge of a world she had never known existed, she finally felt something close to hope for the life that lay ahead of her. News of Elira's arrival did not stay contained within the walls of the sunken court for long. Within days, whispers had spread through the wider Tideborn territories, carried by traders and messengers who moved between the hidden kingdoms scattered along the coast. Some of those whispers reached ears that Kale had hoped would remain ignorant a little while longer. Colin, Kale's most trusted general, arrived at the palace on the third morning, with news that darkened the king's expression considerably. He requested a private audience, and Elira, though not formally invited, insisted on being present. She was tired of decisions being made about her future, in rooms she was not allowed to enter. Word has reached the Vareth stronghold, Colin said grimly, once they were settled in Kale's private study. They know a Draven heir has surfaced. It will not be long before Renwick himself learns of it, if he has not already. Elira looked between the two men, sensing the weight behind the name. Who is Renwick? Cale's jaw tightened. The man responsible for the destruction of my father's court, and the reason your mother fled with you 18 years ago. He commands the Vareth faction, a group that has spent decades trying to seize control of Tideborn territories by eliminating any rival claim to the throne. He's the one who killed your father? Elira asked quietly. Among others, Cale said. He believes the old bloodlines have grown weak, unfit to lead. He has spent years consolidating power, under the belief that strength alone should determine who rules these waters, not birthright. Your existence directly threatens the legitimacy he has spent years building. Colin nodded grimly. If he learns Elira has returned, and is under your protection, he will see it as both a threat and an opportunity. A threat to his claim, and an opportunity to finish what he started years ago. Elira felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the room. You mean he'll come after me? I mean, we will not allow that to happen, Cale said firmly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that steadied the fear rising in her chest. But we cannot be naive about the danger either. Renwick is patient, and he is ruthless. We need to be prepared for whatever move he makes. The conversation that followed outlined plans for increased security around the palace, careful vetting of who was permitted to know of Elira's presence beyond the court, and quiet inquiries into Renwick's current movements. Elira listened intently, determined to understand every detail, rather than remain a passive figure hidden away for her own protection, as her mother had once been. I want to help, she said, once the immediate planning had concluded. Not just sit here waiting to be protected while everyone else decides what happens next. Cale studied her for a long moment. What did you have in mind? You said my blood responds to the water in ways an imposter could never fake, Elira said. If that ability is real, if it's truly part of who I am, then teach me to use it. I won't be useful hiding in a palace room if I don't even understand the one advantage I actually have. Colin glanced at Cale, clearly waiting for his king's judgment on the request. Cale was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind his thoughtful expression, before finally nodding. Very well, he said. Tomorrow, we begin your training. But I want to be clear, Elira. What lies ahead will not be easy. The powers of our bloodline are not simple parlor tricks. They demand discipline, patience, and a willingness to fail, many times before you succeed even once. I've spent 18 years failing to earn a place among people who never wanted me there in the first place, Elira said. I think I can handle a little more failure, as long as it's in service of something that actually matters. Something that might have been pride flickered across Cale's face, quickly masked, but not entirely hidden. Then we start at dawn, he said. Rest well tonight. You will need it. That night, sleep did not come easily. Elira lay awake in her chamber, staring at the soft blue glow of the coral walls, her mind cycling through everything she had learned in the past few days. A stolen bloodline, a hidden kingdom, an enemy who had killed a king and hunted a fleeing mother across years and miles, all to protect a claim to power, built on the elimination of anyone who might challenge it. She thought, too, of her old pack, of Marla's cold satisfaction as she watched Elira drag toward the cliff, of Garrick's dismissive words about a debt finally being paid. She wondered if they had any idea what they had truly thrown away that night, or if they would even care if they knew. Strangely, she found she did not wish harm upon them, not exactly. She only wished, with a quiet, aching clarity, that she had never needed their approval in the first place, that she had known, all those years, exactly what she carried within her blood, and had never allowed their cruelty to convince her she was worth nothing. She fell asleep eventually, with that thought settled firmly in her chest, a small but steady seed of self-worth finally beginning to take root where doubt had lived for so long. Morning arrived with a soft golden light filtering down through the water above the sunken court, and Elira woke with unexpected determination. Nadia helped her dress in simple, practical clothing suited for physical activity, rather than the flowing garments she had worn during her first days at court, and led her to a wide-open training ground near the edge of the palace, where a series of pools and channels had been carved into the stone, connected to the greater ocean beyond. Cale was already waiting, dressed similarly, his expression focused and calm. Today, he said, as she approached, we begin with the most basic principle of our abilities. Water responds to intention and emotion, before it ever responds to raw command. You must learn to feel it before you can hope to shape it. He guided her through the first exercises patiently, teaching her to sense the subtle currents moving through the training pools, to recognize the difference between the water's natural rhythm and the shifts caused by her own presence within it. Progress was slow and often frustrating, small ripples forming and dissolving under her concentrated effort, nothing like the dramatic response she had witnessed the water show toward Kale himself. "You're trying too hard," Kale observed, after her third failed attempt to draw a simple current toward her outstretched hand. "The water does not respond to force, it responds to connection. Stop commanding it, and try, instead, simply to ask." Elira closed her eyes, letting go of the frustration building in her chest, and instead, allowed herself to remember the strange warmth that had spread through her body as she sank beneath the waves on the night of her sacrifice. The sense that something within her had recognized the water as kin rather than enemy. She reached out again, not with force this time, but with something closer to invitation. The water stirred, gently at first, then more decisively, curling upward from the pool in a slow, graceful arc that hovered briefly in the air before splashing back down. Elira's eyes flew open in astonishment, a laugh of pure disbelief escaping her before she could stop it. "I did it," she breathed. "I actually did it." Kale's expression, usually so carefully controlled, broke into a genuine smile, warm and unguarded, in a way she had not yet seen from him. "You did," he agreed, "and that, Elira, is only the very beginning of what you are capable of." They continued training through the morning, Elira's small successes building slowly upon one another, each new movement of water bringing with it a fresh wave of astonished pride. For the first time since she could remember, she was learning something that felt entirely her own, a skill built not on desperate attempts to earn approval, but on the simple joy of discovering a part of herself that had always existed, waiting patiently to be found. As the training session finally drew to a close, Kale watched her with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You have your mother's gift," he said. "Perhaps even more raw potential than she had, if I'm being honest. It will not be long before you surpass what most Tideborn achieve in a lifetime of practice." Elira wiped water from her face, breathless but exhilarated. "I have a good teacher," she said. "You have determination," Kale corrected gently. "That matters far more than any teacher ever could." He paused, studying her for a long moment before adding, "Your pack was wrong about you, Elira. Utterly and completely wrong. I hope, every day you spend here, you come to understand that a little more deeply." Elira looked out at the training pool, still faintly rippling from her efforts, and felt something settle firmly into place within her chest, a quiet certainty that had never existed during her years among the Moonfall Pack. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She had simply been waiting, all this time, for someone to help her discover exactly what she was. Weeks passed at the sunken court, and Elira's days settled into a rhythm she had never known during her years with the Moonfall Pack. Mornings were spent training with Kale in the water channels, her control over the currents growing steadily stronger with each session. Afternoons were devoted to lessons with Priya, who, despite her early skepticism, had taken on the task of teaching Elira the history, customs, and laws of the Tideborn people, with a rigor that left no room for shortcuts. "A queen who does not understand her own kingdom's history is a queen who will be easily deceived," Priya told her, during one particularly demanding lesson, spreading a series of ancient maps across the table between them. Renwick did not rise to power through strength alone. He understood the weaknesses in our laws, our succession customs, the gaps left by a court too complacent to guard against ambition. You must understand these things as well, or better, if you hope to ever hold real power here. Elira absorbed every lesson with the same hungry determination she had once reserved for proving her worth to a pack that never valued her. Only now, the effort felt entirely different. She was not learning to earn scraps of grudging tolerance. She was learning to claim something that had always been rightfully hers. Evenings, more often than not, found her in Kale's company, whether reviewing security reports with Colin, studying old portraits and records in the archive room, or simply walking the quiet corridors of the palace as the court settled into rest around them. Their conversations had grown easier over the weeks, the careful formality of their first meetings softening into something warmer, more familiar. "You've changed since you arrived," Cale observed one evening, as they stood together at the archway overlooking the open water. The girl I pulled from the ocean barely spoke above a whisper. Now Priya tells me you argued with her for 20 minutes today, about outdated inheritance customs. Illyra laughed, a sound that had grown far more natural to her in recent weeks. She was wrong, and I told her so. Apparently that's not something people are used to hearing from me. It's not something anyone here is used to hearing from most people, Cale said, amusement clear in his voice. Priya has terrified this council into silence for years. I find it refreshing that you refuse to be intimidated by her. I spent 18 years being intimidated into silence, Illyra said, more seriously now. I'm done with that. I'd rather be wrong and speak up than stay quiet and small just to make someone else comfortable. Cale turned to study her, something thoughtful and warm in his expression. Your mother would be proud of you, he said quietly. I did not know her well, only through my father's stories, and the few years our family's paths crossed before she disappeared. But I believe she would recognize this same fire in you. Illyra felt a familiar ache at the mention of her mother, though it had grown gentler over the weeks, softened by the steady accumulation of stories and history that had slowly rebuilt her understanding of the woman she had lost so young. I hope so, she said softly. I like to think she'd be proud of who I'm becoming, even if she never got to see it happen. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the slow drift of luminous creatures through the dark water beyond the archway. Illyra found herself increasingly aware of Cale's presence beside her during these quiet moments, an awareness that had grown steadily alongside her confidence and her control over her newfound abilities. Can I ask you something? She said finally, breaking the silence. Of course. Why did you come for me that night? She asked. You said you felt my blood calling out, but there must have been others who could have responded. Why did the king himself swim out to save a girl he'd never met? Cale considered the question carefully before answering, because the moment I felt that call, I understood what it meant, he said. Not simply that a Tideborn was in danger, but that the last hope of restoring what Renwick nearly destroyed was slipping away beneath the waves. I could not send someone else to carry that responsibility. If you were going to be saved, I needed to be certain it was done properly, with the urgency such a moment demanded. That's a very practical answer, Illyra said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Cale's expression shifted slightly, something more vulnerable flickering beneath his composed exterior. It is not the only answer, he admitted, but it was the one I told myself that night, before I understood how much more complicated my reasons would become. Illyra's heart quickened at the implication behind his words, though neither of them moved to close the careful distance still standing between them. And now? She asked quietly. What reasons would you give now? Cale turned to face her fully, his gaze steady and searching. Now I would tell you that I have come to care for you, Illyra, in ways I did not expect and certainly did not plan for when I pulled you from that water. You are not simply a bloodline I am obligated to protect. You are someone I have come to genuinely admire, for your strength, your determination, and your refusal to let cruelty define who you become. The words settled over Illyra like warm sunlight breaking through cold water, and for a moment she could not find any response adequate to match the sincerity in his voice. I care for you too, she finally managed. More than I expected to, given everything that's happened in such a short time. Cale reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and gently took her hand in his. Then perhaps, he said softly, we might allow ourselves to explore what that means, in time, without the pressure of prophecy or bloodlines dictating what should happen between us. I'd like that, Illyra said, her fingers curling naturally around his. I'd like that very much. Their quiet moment was interrupted, some time later, by hurried footsteps echoing through the corridor behind them. Colin appeared, his expression grim and urgent, immediately dispelling the warmth that had settled between them. My king, Colin said, breathless. Scouts have confirmed movement near the northern border. Vareth ships, more than we've seen in years, moving in formation toward our territory. Cale's expression hardened instantly, the softness of moments before, replaced by the sharp focus Illyra had first witnessed the night he pulled her from the cliffs. Renwick, he said grimly. It appears so, Colin confirmed. Whatever plans he had been building quietly for years, It seems the news of Alira's return has accelerated his timeline considerably. Alira felt a familiar chill settle over her, the peaceful weeks of training and discovery suddenly giving way to the harsh reality of the danger that had followed her even into this hidden kingdom. "What does this mean?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "It means the peace we've enjoyed these past weeks is coming to an end," Cale said grimly. "Renwick does not send ships in formation without intending to use them. We need to prepare, immediately, for whatever comes next." As Cale and Colin moved quickly to gather the council and begin preparations, Alira remained a moment longer at the archway, staring out at the dark water beyond, remembering Priya's earlier warning about a queen who did not understand the true stakes of the kingdom she hoped to claim. The lessons, the training, the slow accumulation of history and skill over these past weeks had all been building towards something. She simply had not expected that moment to arrive so soon. She thought of her mother, fleeing with an infant daughter to protect her from exactly this kind of threat, choosing 18 years of hardship and secrecy over the danger of confrontation. Alira understood, now, in a way she could not have before these weeks of training and learning, exactly what her mother had sacrificed to keep her safe. But Alira was not her mother. She had spent 18 years being told she was nothing, only to discover that she carried within her blood the power to command the very ocean itself. She would not spend the rest of her life hiding from the man who had destroyed her family and forced her mother into decades of fear. Squaring her shoulders, Alira turned away from the archway and followed the path Cale and Colin had taken toward the council chamber, ready, for the first time in her life, to fight for something that truly belonged to her. The council chamber was already crowded by the time Alira arrived. Advisors and military officers gathered around the great stone table, voices overlapping in urgent discussion. Priya stood near a large map of the surrounding territories, marking positions with small carved stones that represented the movement of the Vareth fleet. "They've made no secret of their approach," Priya was saying, as Alira entered, "which tells us this is not a stealth attack. Renwick wants us to know he is coming." "A show of strength," Cale said grimly, studying the map. "He wants Alira, and the rest of us, to understand exactly how much power he commands before he ever makes a formal demand." "What kind of demand?" Alira asked, moving to stand beside Cale at the table. Colin answered her, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. "Renwick will likely demand your surrender, along with formal recognition of his claim to the Tideborn throne. He has spent years building the argument that the old bloodlines are too weak to lead, that only strength earned through conquest deserves to rule these waters. Your continued existence directly undermines everything he has built his authority upon." "And if I refuse to surrender?" Alira asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it spoken aloud. "Then he will attempt to take this kingdom by force," Cale said. "Something he has clearly been preparing to do for some time, judging by the size of the fleet approaching our borders." The room fell into tense discussion of defenses, troop movements, and the delicate diplomatic questions of whether any of the neighboring Tideborn territories might be persuaded to send aid against Renwick's growing power. Alira listened intently, absorbing every detail with the same focus she had applied to Priya's history lessons over the past weeks, determined to understand every dimension of the threat now facing the kingdom that had welcomed her. As the meeting stretched late into the night, Alira found herself increasingly troubled by a thought she could not quite shake. Renwick's fleet was approaching because of her, because her return had threatened the fragile stability he had built through years of careful manipulation and conquest. The people gathered in this room, people who had shown her nothing but kindness and patience during her weeks at court, were now preparing to risk their lives defending a claim she had not even known she possessed a month ago. "Perhaps," she said finally, once a lull settled over the debate, "there's another option we haven't considered." All eyes turned to her, and she felt a flicker of the old nervousness that had plagued her during her years with the Moonfall Pack, the instinct to shrink back rather than speak her mind. She pushed through it, remembering Priya's earlier lessons about the cost of silence. "What if I went to him?" she continued. "Not to surrender, but to speak with him directly. Perhaps there's a way to resolve this without a war that could cost countless lives." The suggestion was met with immediate and forceful objection from nearly everyone in the room. Colin was the first to speak, his voice sharp with alarm. "Absolutely not. Renwick has spent years trying to eliminate your bloodline entirely. Walking into his presence would be nothing short of suicide. He's right, Cale said, though his tone was gentler than Colin's, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her and his respect for her willingness to consider difficult solutions. Renwick does not negotiate in good faith, Alira. He has proven that time and again throughout his rise to power. Any meeting would be a trap, nothing more. Alira felt a flash of frustration at being dismissed so quickly, though she understood the concern behind their objections. I'm not suggesting I go alone, or unprotected, she clarified. But if there's even a small chance we could avoid a battle that will cost lives on both sides, don't we owe it to everyone in this kingdom to at least consider it? Priya, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke, her expression thoughtful rather than immediately dismissive. There may be wisdom in her instinct, even if the specific approach is too dangerous to attempt directly, she said. Renwick built his power on the argument that the old bloodlines are weak and unfit to lead. A princess willing to face him directly, without cowering, might undermine that narrative more effectively than any battle could. That is still incredibly dangerous, Cale said, though Alira could see him weighing the possibility, despite his reservations. Everything about this situation is dangerous, Alira said quietly, but hiding didn't protect my mother forever, and I don't think it will protect this kingdom either. At some point, we have to stop running from Renwick and start standing against him directly. The debate continued for another hour, gradually shifting from outright rejection of Alira's suggestion toward careful consideration of how such a confrontation might be managed safely. By the time the council finally adjourned, no firm decision had been reached, but the seed of the idea had been planted, and Alira could see it taking root in the thoughtful expressions of those who had initially dismissed it outright. Cale found her later that night, standing once again at the archway overlooking the dark water, her mind still turning over the events of the evening. He joined her quietly, saying nothing for a long moment before finally breaking the silence. I understand why you suggested what you did tonight, he said, and I respect the courage it took to offer yourself as a potential solution to this conflict. But I need you to understand something, Alira. I did not pull you from that ocean, only to watch you walk willingly into danger, for the sake of people who have known you for a matter of weeks. They're not just people I've known for a few weeks, Alira said softly. This is my kingdom too, Cale. My mother's kingdom. I won't hide behind these walls while others risk their lives protecting something that belongs to me, as much as it belongs to any of them. Cale's expression softened, though the worry remained clear in his eyes. Your mother hid you away to protect you, he said. Perhaps there is wisdom in that instinct, even now. My mother hid me because she had no other choice, Alira said. She had no kingdom to return to, no army to call upon, no allies willing to stand beside her. I have all of those things now, because of you. I don't intend to waste that advantage by hiding, just because the alternative feels safer. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant admiration flickering across his face. You truly are your mother's daughter, he said finally. Stubborn, fearless, and utterly unwilling to accept the safe path when a harder one might serve a greater purpose. Is that a compliment? Alira asked, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the tension of the evening. It is, Cale said, returning her smile with one of his own, though worry still lingered behind his eyes. Though I confess, it does little to ease my concerns about what lies ahead. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the dark water drift past the archway, both of them aware that whatever decision the council ultimately reached, the days ahead would test everything Alira had learned, and everything she had come to believe about her own strength, since that terrible night on the cliffs. Whatever happens, Cale said finally, know that I will not let Renwick harm you, not while I still draw breath. And I won't let him harm this kingdom, Alira replied firmly, not while I still have any power to prevent it. Neither of them spoke of the danger that lay ahead again that night, content instead to simply stand together in the quiet darkness, drawing whatever strength they could from each other before the coming days demanded everything they had to give. 3 days later, the council reached a decision. Alira would not go to Renwick alone, nor would the kingdom simply wait passively for his fleet to arrive at their borders. Instead, Cale proposed a careful demonstration of strength, a formal procession to the border waters, where Alira would be presented publicly as the confirmed Draven heir, flanked by the full might of the Tideborn Royal Guard. It was, Priya explained, a way of directly challenging Renwick's narrative, without walking blindly into a trap of his making. If he wants a confrontation, Kale said during the final planning session, we will give him one on our terms, in a place and manner of our choosing, surrounded by enough strength that any attempt at treachery would cost him more than he's prepared to lose. Illyra spent the days leading up to the procession in intensive training, pushing her control over the water further than she had ever attempted before. Kale worked with her personally each morning, his patient guidance gradually giving way to increasingly demanding exercises as her confidence and ability grew. You've made remarkable progress, Kale told her one morning, after she successfully redirected a powerful current that would have overwhelmed her attempts just 2 weeks earlier. Faster progress than I've seen from any Tideborn in training, myself included. I have good reason to learn quickly, Illyra said, wiping water from her face, breathless but satisfied with her progress. Renwick isn't going to wait for me to master these abilities at a comfortable pace. No, Kale agreed, his expression growing serious. He is not, which is why I want to show you something today that we have not yet attempted. He led her to a deeper section of the training grounds, where the water grew darker and the pressure more noticeable, even to Illyra's growing senses. The most advanced Tideborn abilities involve not simply directing water that already exists, he explained, but calling upon the deeper currents, the ancient power that flows beneath even the ocean's visible movements. It is dangerous and difficult to control, but it is also the source of the true strength our bloodline is known for. Illyra felt a flicker of apprehension mixed with determination. Show me, she said simply. Kale demonstrated first, extending his hand toward the deep water below them, and Illyra watched in astonishment as a powerful current rose from far beneath the training pool, spiraling upward in a controlled column of churning water that responded to his every subtle gesture. The display of power was breathtaking, a clear demonstration of exactly why Kale commanded such respect and authority among his people. This takes years to master, he warned, as the current settled back into its natural rhythm. I do not expect you to achieve anything close to this level of control before the procession. But I want you to understand what lies within you, waiting to be discovered, with enough time and patience. Illyra approached the edge of the pool, closing her eyes and reaching, not toward the surface water she had grown comfortable directing, but toward the deeper, darker currents Kale had just demonstrated. She felt resistance immediately, a power far greater and more chaotic than anything she had worked with before, but beneath that resistance, she also felt something else. Recognition. The same warmth that had first saved her life in the ocean, stirring now in response to her deliberate effort to reach it. Slowly, carefully, she drew upon that deeper current, feeling the strain of the effort settle into her muscles and mind alike. The water below her stirred, then rose, not with the same effortless grace Kale had displayed, but with a raw, untamed power that surprised them both. Illyra, Kale said sharply, that's enough for now. You're pushing too far too quickly. But Illyra, caught up in the exhilaration of feeling such immense power respond to her will, pushed further still, drawing more of the deep current upward, until the water around them began to churn violently, far beyond the controlled column Kale had demonstrated moments before. Panic began to creep into her concentration as she realized she had lost control of what she had summoned. Kale moved quickly, stepping beside her and placing his hand firmly over hers, lending his own steady control to help guide the chaotic energy she had unleashed back into something manageable. Together, their combined effort gradually calmed the churning water, the wild current settling slowly back into the deep stillness from which it had come. Breathless and slightly shaken, Illyra turned to Kale, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I'm sorry, she said. I got carried away. Do not apologize, Kale said, though his tone remained firm. What you just did, reaching that deep current at all, after only weeks of training, is remarkable. But you must learn restraint alongside power, Illyra. Uncontrolled strength is as dangerous to you as it is impressive to witness. I understand, Illyra said, taking the lesson to heart. I won't make that mistake again. They continued training more cautiously for the remainder of the session, Kale carefully guiding her toward better control rather than raw power, until the sun began to set, and exhaustion finally forced them both to rest. As they walked back toward the palace together, Elira found herself reflecting on the strange duality of what she had discovered within herself. Power enough to threaten even her own safety if left unchecked, but also power enough, perhaps, to finally stand against the man who had destroyed her family and forced her mother into decades of hiding. The morning of the procession arrived with a tension that hung heavy over the entire sunken court. Elira dressed carefully in ceremonial clothing provided by Nadia, deep blue fabric embroidered with silver patterns meant to represent the ancient symbols of House Draven, a visual reminder to anyone who saw her exactly which bloodline she represented. "You look every bit the princess your mother once was," Nadia said softly, adjusting the final details of Elira's attire. "I hope, whatever happens today, that you remember how far you've come since that night on the cliffs." "I will," Elira said, though nervousness churned in her stomach despite her outward composure. "Thank you, Nadia, for everything these past weeks." The royal guard assembled at the palace entrance, an impressive formation of Tideborn warriors, whose presence alone spoke volumes about the strength Kael commanded. Kael himself waited at the front, dressed in formal armor that gleamed even in the dim light of the underwater palace, his expression composed but tense with the weight of what lay ahead. "Are you ready?" he asked, as Elira joined him at the head of the procession. "As ready as I'll ever be," Elira replied honestly. Together, they led the procession out through the palace's great archway and into the open ocean beyond, the entire assembled guard moving in disciplined formation toward the border waters where Renwick's fleet had been sighted. Elira felt the weight of countless eyes upon her as they moved, both from her own people and, she suspected, from scouts positioned to report every detail of their approach to Renwick himself. The border waters, when they finally arrived, revealed the full scope of the threat that had been building for weeks. Renwick's fleet stretched across the horizon, ship after ship, arranged in a formation clearly designed to intimidate anyone who dared approach. At the center of the formation, a single vessel larger than the rest flew a banner Elira did not recognize, though the tension radiating from Kael beside her told her exactly whose colors it represented. "Renwick," Kael confirmed quietly, following her gaze. "He's come personally, which tells us he considers this confrontation important enough to risk his own presence." As their procession drew closer, a smaller vessel detached from Renwick's fleet, moving forward to meet them at the boundary between the two territories. Elira's heart pounded as the ship approached, and for the first time since arriving at the sunken court, she found herself face to face with the man responsible for the destruction of her family, the reason her mother had spent the last years of her life in fearful hiding. Renwick was older than Elira had expected, his hair streaked with gray, his expression carrying the confident authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. He studied her with cold, calculating eyes, taking in every detail of her appearance with the scrutiny of someone assessing a potential threat, rather than a rival he considered beneath him. "So," Renwick said finally, his voice carrying easily across the water between their vessels, "the lost princess finally emerges from her hiding place. I confess, I had begun to believe Ilyana's daughter had perished long ago, alongside her mother's foolish hope of restoring House Draven's claim to power." "My mother did not die foolishly," Elira said, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear pounding through her chest. "She died protecting the last hope of a bloodline you tried to destroy through violence and murder." Renwick's expression flickered with something like amusement, though his eyes remained cold. Bold words from a girl raised among wolves, unaware of her own heritage until a matter of weeks ago. "Tell me, princess, what exactly do you believe you understand about the responsibilities of ruling these waters?" "I understand that power built on murder and fear is not the same as power earned through the trust and respect of the people you claim to lead," Elira replied, drawing on every lesson Priya had drilled into her over the past weeks. "You may command a larger fleet than I do today, Renwick, but fear is not loyalty. Sooner or later, those who serve you out of fear will find the courage to stand against you, just as I am standing against you now." For a moment, something flickered across Renwick's composed expression, a flash of genuine anger, quickly suppressed beneath his careful mask of confidence. "Careful, princess," he said, his voice growing colder. "Bold words have a way of becoming costly promises." "Then let us be clear about the promises being made here today," Kael interjected, his voice carrying the full authority of his position as Alpha King. "Elira is under my protection, and by extension, under the protection of every warrior assembled behind me. Any attempt to harm her will be met with the full strength of the Tideborn Kingdom, regardless of the cost to either side. Renwick's gaze shifted to Cale, calculating the odds of the confrontation now clearly forming before him. Whatever conclusion he reached, he did not immediately act upon it, instead offering a thin, humorless smile. A bold stance, for a kingdom still recovering from the wounds I dealt it years ago, he said. But perhaps today is not the day for such a costly confrontation. I will withdraw, for now, and consider carefully how best to address this complication to my plans. With that, Renwick's vessel began to retreat, rejoining the larger formation of ships still waiting at the horizon. Slowly, over the following hour, the entire Vareth fleet began to withdraw, retreating back toward whatever territory they had come from, leaving Alira and the assembled Tideborn Guard standing victorious, if uneasy, at the border they had come to defend. "That's it?" Alira asked, disbelief evident in her voice as she watched the retreating ships. "He's just leaving?" "For now," Cale said grimly, though relief was evident beneath his cautious tone. "Renwick is not a man who abandons his ambitions easily. He withdrew today because the cost of confrontation outweighed the potential gain, not because he has given up his intentions toward this kingdom, or toward you." Alira felt the tension slowly draining from her body, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from facing down the man who had haunted her family's history for 18 years. "So this isn't over," she said quietly. "No," Cale confirmed. "But today, you stood before the man who murdered my father and hunted your mother across years and miles, and you did not flinch. That alone is a victory worth acknowledging, even if the larger conflict still lies ahead of us." As their procession turned back toward the sunken court, Alira found herself reflecting on the strange mixture of triumph and lingering dread that settled over her chest. She had faced Renwick, had refused to be intimidated by his cold authority, and had walked away with her kingdom, her people, and her own life intact. But she understood, with a clarity that had grown alongside her weeks of training and learning, that the true battle for her family's legacy had only just begun. In the weeks following the confrontation at the border, life at the sunken court settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by the constant awareness that Renwick's retreat had bought them time rather than peace. Cale increased security throughout the kingdom, and Alira's training intensified further, both of them understanding that whatever came next would demand more from her than the careful, measured progress of her early weeks at court. "You handled yourself well against Renwick," Priya told her during one of their now regular strategy sessions, spreading fresh reports across the council table. "Better than I expected, if I'm honest, but he will not make the same mistake of underestimating you twice." "What do you think he'll do next?" Alira asked, studying the reports of Vareth movements that had continued, quietly, even after the fleet's retreat from the border. "Renwick built his power through patience, as much as through force," Priya said. "He will not launch a direct assault again so soon, not after the show of strength you and Cale presented at the border. Instead, I suspect he will look for weaknesses, alliances he can break, doubts he can plant, anything that might undermine your position, without requiring open conflict." Alira absorbed this warning seriously, understanding that the battle ahead would require more than simply mastering her water abilities. It would require the kind of political awareness Priya had spent weeks drilling into her, the careful navigation of loyalty and doubt that had allowed Renwick to build his power in the first place. That awareness proved prescient sooner than Alira expected. Barely a week after the confrontation at the border, whispers began circulating through the sunken court, quiet doubts about whether Alira truly possessed the strength necessary to lead the kingdom through the coming conflict with Renwick. Some questioned whether her weeks of training could possibly match the decades of experience Renwick's most trusted commanders possessed. Others, more troublingly, began to suggest that perhaps the kingdom's best chance of survival lay in negotiating some manner of peace with Renwick directly, even if it meant sacrificing Alira's claim to the throne. Cale brought these concerns to her directly one evening, his expression heavy with the burden of delivering unwelcome news. "There are voices within the court suggesting we should reconsider our position," he said carefully. "Not many, and not voices I take seriously myself, but enough that I wanted you to hear it from me, rather than through rumor." Alira felt a familiar sting at the suggestion, an echo of the years spent being told she was not worth the trouble of defending. But this time, Rather than shrinking from the doubt, she found herself steadied by the weeks of training and growth that had reshaped her sense of her own worth. "What do you think, Kale?" she asked. "Do you share their doubts?" "No," Kale said immediately, without hesitation. "I have watched you grow more in these past weeks than most Tideborn achieve in years of dedicated study. I have watched you face Renwick himself without flinching, despite everything he represents to your family's history. Whatever doubts exist among a small portion of this court, they do not reflect my own assessment of your strength or your worthiness to claim your mother's legacy." His certainty steadied something in Alira's chest, though she understood the doubts circulating through the court could not simply be dismissed. "Perhaps I should address these concerns directly," she suggested, rather than letting them fester in whispers and rumors. The opportunity arose sooner than expected, when Priya proposed a formal gathering of the full court, an event meant to allow Alira to demonstrate both her growing command of Tideborn abilities and her understanding of the kingdom's history and customs, addressing the doubts circulating among some members of the court directly, rather than allowing them to spread unchecked. Alira prepared carefully for the gathering, drawing upon every lesson Priya had taught her, every hour of training Kale had guided her through, determined to prove, once and for all, that she belonged among the people who had welcomed her into their kingdom. When the day arrived, she stood before the assembled court with a confidence that would have been unimaginable to the girl who had been thrown from the cliffs only 2 months before. "I know some among you have doubts about my ability to lead this kingdom through the challenges ahead," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall. "I understand those doubts. I arrived here knowing nothing of my heritage, nothing of your customs, nothing beyond the fragile hope that I might somehow prove worthy of a legacy I did not even know I carried." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the gathered faces before continuing. "But I have spent every day since that arrival, learning, training, and preparing myself to earn the trust that a birthright alone cannot provide. I stood before Renwick, the man who murdered King Kale's father, and hunted my own mother across years of exile, and I did not flinch. I will not pretend that experience alone qualifies me to lead this kingdom, but I promise you this: I will not stop working to earn that qualification, every single day, for as long as you allow me the chance to prove it." To demonstrate the truth of her words, Alira moved to the center of the hall, where a series of ceremonial pools had been prepared for exactly this purpose, and called upon the training she had undergone with Kale over the previous weeks. Carefully, deliberately, she reached toward the deeper currents beneath the pool's surface, drawing upon the same power that had nearly overwhelmed her during her earlier training session, but this time with the control and discipline she had worked so hard to develop. The water rose in a graceful, controlled column, spiraling upward with a precision that drew gasps of surprise from many in the gathered crowd. She held the display for a long moment, demonstrating a level of control that few Tideborn achieved, even after years of dedicated training, before gently allowing the water to settle back into its natural rhythm. Silence followed her demonstration, and then, slowly, applause began to spread through the hall, starting with Nadia and Colin near the front, and gradually building until the entire assembly had joined in acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. Even Priya, standing near the edge of the gathering, offered a small, approving nod that meant more to Alira than perhaps any other response in the room. Kale approached her once the applause had settled, his expression filled with unmistakable pride. "I believe," he said quietly, for her ears alone, "that you have answered every doubt this court might have harbored, and then some." "I hope so," Alira said, still catching her breath from the effort of the demonstration. "I don't want anyone here defending my claim to this throne out of obligation, Kale. I want them to believe it, the way I've come to believe it myself." "After today," Kale said, "I don't think that will be a concern any longer." In the days that followed, the whispers of doubt that had circulated through the court largely faded, replaced by growing confidence in Alira's ability to lead. A confidence built not on the accident of her birth, but on the demonstrated strength of her character, and her willingness to earn the trust of the people around her. It was, Alira reflected, a very different kind of validation than anything she had experienced during her years with the Moonfall Pack, where no amount of effort had ever seemed sufficient to earn even basic acceptance. But even as the court's confidence in her grew, the shadow of Renwick's ambition remained, a quiet threat that had not disappeared simply because his fleet had withdrawn from the border. Alira understood, with growing clarity, that the true test of her strength and her claim to her mother's legacy still lay ahead, waiting in whatever move Renwick chose to make next. The attack, when it finally came, arrived not through open confrontation, but through betrayal, exactly as Priya had warned it might. Nearly a month after the confrontation at the border, Colin arrived at Alira's chamber late one night, his expression grave, in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. "There's been a breach," he said without preamble. "Someone within the court has been passing information to Renwick for weeks. We only just discovered it tonight, and by the time we did, the damage had already been done." Alira's heart pounded as she followed Colin quickly through the corridors toward the council chamber, where Kale and Priya already waited, their expressions tight with barely controlled alarm. "What kind of damage?" she asked, though dread was already forming a pit in her stomach. "Renwick knows the layout of our defenses," Priya said grimly. "Our patrol schedules, the weak points in our border patrols, even details about your training and abilities that should never have left this court. We believe he has been planning a direct assault on the sunken court itself, timed to exploit exactly the vulnerabilities this traitor provided." "When?" Kale asked, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "Our scouts report movement already underway," Colin said. "If our estimates are correct, his forces could reach the outer defenses within hours." The council chamber erupted into urgent activity, commanders being summoned, defenses hastily reorganized to compensate for the compromised information Renwick now possessed. Alira found herself swept up in the chaos, her training over the past months finally facing the true test it had been preparing her for since that first morning at the training pools. "I want to fight," she told Kale, as preparations continued around them. "Not hide away while everyone else defends this kingdom. I've trained for exactly this moment." Kale studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect her and his recognition that she had earned the right to make this choice for herself. "If you fight," he said finally, "you fight beside me, not separated into some corner of the battle where I cannot reach you if something goes wrong. Do you understand?" "I understand," Alira agreed. "I don't want to be anywhere else." As dawn approached, scouts confirmed what the council had feared. Renwick's forces, larger and more prepared than the fleet that had retreated from the border weeks earlier, were converging directly on the sunken court, moving with the confidence of an enemy who believed they held every advantage. The defenders of the kingdom, though caught somewhat off guard by the speed of the assault, rallied quickly, drawing on weeks of preparation that Kale had insisted upon since the earlier confrontation. The battle began at first light, chaos erupting through the water surrounding the sunken court as Renwick's forces pressed their assault against the kingdom's defenses. Alira fought alongside Kale at the heart of the conflict, her training finally proving its worth as she called upon the water around her to defend against wave after wave of attacking forces, her control steadier and more precise than even she had expected under the pressure of genuine combat. "You're doing well," Kale called to her, during a brief lull in the fighting, his own control over the surrounding water evident in the way attacking forces struggled against currents he had shaped to slow their advance. "Stay close. We're holding the line." But as the battle wore on, it became clear that Renwick's forces had come prepared with more than simple numbers. A contingent of his most skilled fighters pressed directly toward the palace itself, clearly targeting Alira specifically, their assault growing more focused and desperate as the morning progressed. "They're trying to separate us," Kale shouted, as a sudden surge of attackers forced a gap between their positions. "Alira, fall back toward the palace." But before she could comply, a powerful current, clearly directed by skilled Tideborn control, slammed into her from the side, driving her away from Kale and deeper into the chaos of the battle. She struggled to regain her footing, her control over the surrounding water faltering under the unexpected assault, and found herself suddenly surrounded by a group of Renwick's most experienced fighters, cut off from the main body of the Tideborn defense. "The princess," one of the attackers said, a cold smile spreading across his face as he recognized her isolation. "Renwick will be pleased." Fear surged through Alira's chest, but beneath that fear, something else stirred, the same deep, ancient power she had touched during her training with Kale, weeks before. The power he had warned her not to reach for without proper control and preparation. With her back against the wall, and no other option available, she reached for it anyway, drawing upon the deepest currents she could sense, desperate to protect herself against the encircling attackers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. far beyond anything she had managed even during her most successful training sessions. The water around her erupted into a violent, churning storm, driven by an intensity of will she had never before allowed herself to fully unleash. Her attackers, caught completely off guard by the sudden and dramatic shift in the battle, scrambled to defend themselves against a force far greater than they had anticipated facing. Elira felt the raw power coursing through her, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, the same lack of control that had frightened her during training, now serving as her only defense against the very real danger surrounding her. She did not fully understand what she was doing, only that the deep currents were responding to her fear and determination, with a ferocity that scattered her attackers, driving them back through the churning water. Elira. Kale's voice cut through the chaos, and she turned to see him fighting his way toward her, his own control over the water shaping a path through the remaining attackers between them. When he finally reached her, he found her standing amid the wreckage of the battle she had just survived, breathless and shaking, but very much alive. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands finding her shoulders as he studied her for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," Elira managed, though her voice trembled with the after-effects of the power she had just unleashed. "I didn't know what else to do. I reached for the deep current, the way you showed me, and it just responded." Kale's expression shifted from concern to something like astonished pride, even amid the chaos still surrounding them. "You survived an ambush meant specifically to capture or kill you," he said. "That is no small thing, Elira. Whatever instinct guided you in that moment, it served you well." Around them, the tide of the battle had begun to shift. Word of Elira's dramatic display had spread quickly among both the defending forces and Renwick's attacking fighters, and the psychological impact was undeniable. The Tideborn defenders, emboldened by the sight of their princess surviving and repelling a direct assault meant to eliminate her, fought with renewed determination, while Renwick's forces, having witnessed a display of power they had not anticipated, began to falter in their previously confident advance. By midday, the tide had fully turned. Renwick's forces, having lost the element of surprise and facing defenders who fought with a determination that far exceeded what their intelligence had led them to expect, began a disorganized retreat, abandoning the assault that had begun with such confidence only hours before. Elira and Kale stood together near the palace entrance as the last of the attacking forces withdrew, both of them exhausted but alive, the kingdom they had fought to protect still standing despite the treachery and assault it had endured. Around them, the Tideborn defenders began the grim work of tending to the wounded and assessing the damage the battle had caused. "We need to find the traitor who provided Renwick with our defenses," Priya said, joining them as the immediate danger passed, her expression grim despite the victory they had just achieved. "This assault came far too close to succeeding for us to simply move forward without addressing how such a breach occurred." "We will," Kale promised. "But first, let us tend to our wounded and confirm that Renwick's forces have truly withdrawn. Whatever betrayal occurred within our walls, it can wait until we've secured the safety of everyone who fought to defend this kingdom today." As the immediate chaos of the battle settled into the quieter, more sober work of recovery, Elira found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A girl thrown from a cliff as an unwanted sacrifice, standing now at the heart of a kingdom she had fought and nearly died to protect, having discovered within herself a strength she never could have imagined during her years among the Moonfall Pack. Kale, sensing her reflective mood, moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers amid the exhausted aftermath of the battle. "You fought like a true queen today," he said quietly. "Renwick has now witnessed exactly what he faces, should he ever attempt something so bold again. This isn't over, is it?" Elira asked, though she already knew the answer. "No," Kale admitted. "But today, we proved something important, both to Renwick and to ourselves. This kingdom, and the bloodline you carry, will not be so easily destroyed. Whatever comes next, we face it together, stronger than we were before this battle began." Elira squeezed his hand, drawing comfort from his steady presence beside her, and looked out over the kingdom they had fought to protect, a kingdom that had become, in the span of a few short months, more truly her home than the Moonfall Pack had ever been in 18 years of empty belonging. The days following the battle at the Sunken Court brought a grim discovery that shook the kingdom nearly as much as the assault itself. The traitor, who had provided Renwick with detailed knowledge of the court's defenses, turned out to be a minor advisor named Edwin, a man who had served the court for years, but harbored long-standing resentment over a perceived slight from earlier in Cale's reign. Under questioning, he revealed not only the extent of his betrayal, but also crucial details about Renwick's remaining forces and his likely next move. "He's regrouping at his stronghold," Colin reported to the assembled council, once Edwin's confession had been fully documented. The failed assault cost him more than he anticipated, both in terms of soldiers and in the confidence of his own commanders, several of whom apparently questioned his judgment in launching such a bold attack based on incomplete intelligence. "Then now is the time to press our advantage," Priya said, studying the maps spread across the council table with renewed determination. "Renwick is vulnerable in a way he has not been in years. If we act decisively, we may finally have the opportunity to end the threat he poses once and for all." Elira listened carefully to the strategic discussion that followed, her role in the planning far more central now than it had been during the earlier confrontation at the border. The battle she had survived, the power she had demonstrated in defending herself and her kingdom, had firmly established her place among the leadership of the Tideborn court, no longer a newcomer whose claim required constant justification. "I want to lead the final confrontation," she said, once the broader strategy had been outlined. "Not simply stand beside Cale as a symbol, but actively participate in ending the threat Renwick has posed to this kingdom, and to my family, for far too long." Cale studied her for a long moment, weighing the request against his instinct to shield her from further danger. But he had watched her grow too much over these past months to dismiss her wishes now, and he nodded slowly. "Then we plan this confrontation together," he said, "as equals, sharing both the risk and the responsibility of whatever outcome we achieve." The following week was spent in careful preparation, gathering intelligence on Renwick's remaining forces, coordinating with allied territories who had watched the earlier battle with growing respect for the resilience the sunken court had demonstrated, and refining the strategy that would guide their final confrontation with the man who had haunted Elira's family history for 18 years. When the day finally arrived, the assembled Tideborn forces, bolstered by allies who had chosen to stand with them after witnessing the earlier battle's outcome, moved toward Renwick's stronghold with a confidence and unity that had been absent during the earlier, more uncertain confrontation at the border. The battle that followed was fierce but decisive. Renwick's forces, weakened by the failed assault on the sunken court and increasingly divided by doubts about their leader's judgment, could not match the coordinated strength of Elira and Cale's combined forces. Elira fought at Cale's side throughout the confrontation, her control over the deep currents now steadier and more precise than it had been during the desperate battle weeks earlier, the lessons of that earlier struggle having sharpened her abilities considerably. The confrontation with Renwick himself came near the stronghold's heart, where he made his final, desperate stand against the forces that had finally overwhelmed his ambitions. Elira faced him directly, the same cold, calculating man who had once dismissed her as an unworthy claimant to her family's legacy, now facing the consequences of years spent building power through fear and violence. "You cannot win this," Renwick said, though the confidence that had once colored his voice had faded considerably, replaced by the desperate bravado of a man who understood his position, had become untenable. "Even if you defeat me here, there will always be others who believe strength alone should determine who leads these waters." "Perhaps," Elira acknowledged, standing firm despite the tension of the confrontation. "But I have learned, these past months, that true strength is not found in the fear you've spent years cultivating, Renwick. It is found in the loyalty and trust that a leader earns through their actions, not simply demands through force. That is a lesson you never learned, and it is why your ambitions end here today." The final confrontation was swift, Elira's mastery of the deep currents, combined with Cale's steady support, proving more than sufficient to overcome Renwick's remaining resistance. When it was finally over, Renwick's forces surrendered, his stronghold fell, and the threat that had shaped Elira's family history for 18 years finally came to an end. In the weeks that followed the final battle, the Tideborn kingdom began the slow work of recovery and rebuilding, the wounds of years spent under threat, from Renwick's ambitions gradually beginning to heal. Elira found herself increasingly embraced, not simply as the returned heir of a lost bloodline, but as a leader who had earned her place through demonstrated courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to the people who had welcomed her into their kingdom. A formal ceremony was held, weeks later, to celebrate both the kingdom's victory over Renwick's threat and Alira's official recognition as heir to the Draven legacy her mother had fled with her to protect so many years before. The great hall of the Sunken Court, the same hall where she had once stood before a skeptical council demanding proof of her worthiness, now overflowed with citizens and allies who had come to witness the formal recognition of everything she had fought so hard to earn. Cale stood beside her throughout the ceremony, his pride evident in every glance he offered her as Priya formally presented her to the assembled crowd as the confirmed and celebrated heir of House Draven. When the formal proceedings concluded, he took her hand before the entire gathered court, his expression carrying a warmth and certainty that needed no further words to convey his meaning. 8 months ago, he said, addressing the crowd though his eyes remained fixed on Alira, I pulled a stranger from the depths of the ocean, uncertain of what I would find beyond a call of tide-born blood I could not ignore. What I found was a woman of extraordinary strength, courage, and heart, someone who has earned every honor this kingdom now bestows upon her, not through the accident of her birth, but through the choices she has made every single day since that fateful night. The crowd's applause swelled around them, but Alira found herself focused entirely on Cale, on the steady warmth in his eyes as he continued speaking, his words carrying a weight that went beyond simple ceremonial praise. I would be honored, he said, his voice softening as he turned fully toward her, if you would consider standing beside me, not merely as an ally in this kingdom's defense, but as my equal partner in leading it forward, for as long as we both shall live. Alira felt tears rising, not from grief or fear, as they so often had during her difficult journey to this moment, but from an overwhelming sense of joy and belonging she had never expected to find after the cruelty of her early life. Yes, she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I would be honored as well. The celebration that followed stretched long into the night, the entire Sunken Court joining in joyful recognition of both the kingdom's hard-won victory and the union between their king and the returned princess, who had proven, beyond any doubt, that she belonged among them. Alira moved through the celebration, surrounded by friends she had come to cherish deeply. Nadia's warm laughter, Priya's rare but genuine smile, Colin's steady congratulations, each of them representing the family she had never known she was missing during her years with the Moonfall Pack. Later that evening, as the celebration finally began to quiet, Alira found herself once more at the familiar archway overlooking the dark water, the same place where she had first begun to understand the depth of the power and belonging waiting within her. Cale joined her there, as he so often had during the months of their growing partnership, and together they watched the gentle drift of luminous creatures through the water beyond the palace walls. Do you ever think about that night? Alira asked quietly. The night your pack, my old pack, threw me from the cliffs? Often, Cale admitted, though I find myself grateful for it now, in a strange way. Without that terrible night, I never would have found you, never would have discovered everything you would come to mean to this kingdom, and to me personally. Alira considered this, turning the strange irony of her journey over in her mind. The cruelty of the Moonfall Pack, the betrayal that had nearly cost her life, had ultimately led her not to death, but to a life richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined during her years of quiet suffering among people who never valued her. I used to think that night was the worst thing that ever happened to me, she said. Now I understand it was simply the beginning of finding out who I was always meant to become. Cale pulled her close, and Alira leaned into his embrace, finally, completely at peace with the journey that had brought her to this moment. The ocean stretched out before them, vast and endless, no longer a source of fear but a constant reminder of the strength and belonging she had discovered within its depths. She thought, briefly, of Marla, of Garrick, of the pack that had once decided she was worth nothing more than a sacrifice to appease their fears. She felt no anger toward them any longer, only a quiet, distant pity for people who had never understood the value of what they so carelessly threw away. Their cruelty had not defined her. It had simply been the beginning of a much longer story, one where she had ultimately claimed a crown, a kingdom, and a love more genuine than anything she had ever known. The girl who had been thrown into the ocean as an unwanted offering had become the queen the sea itself had chosen to protect, standing now beside the king, who had walked out of the depths to honor her, exactly as fate had always intended.